We love you. We truly do. And we care for you more than you know. Before we begin this tale, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, settle back into the quiet and let's get started. Rick woke to the faint scent of coffee. Not the sharp, bitter kind from a fresh pot, but a softened aroma like grounds left warm for hours, mingling with something impossible, starlight itself. He blinked, expecting the familiar clutter of his garage, the glow of half-finished gadgets, the comfort of chaos. Instead, there stretched an endless corridor. It had no walls, not really, just shadows that curved like curtains, rippling in and out of focus as though the whole place was breathing. The floor felt solid beneath his feet, yet when he stepped, the sound was hushed as if water swallowed the echo before it could escape. Rick rubbed his eyes. "Dream," he muttered, his voice oddly muffled, like it too was being swallowed. He tried to laugh at himself, but the chuckle caught in his throat. There was a weight pressing against him, not painful but unsettling. A soft unease, the kind that comes when you wake from a nap and can't quite remember which day it is. And then he wondered, was this his dream? Or had he stumbled into someone else's? He touched the corridor's side, his hand passing through light as though it were fabric. Stars shimmered briefly under his palm, then vanished, scattering like embers. The sensation was too vivid to ignore. He wasn't dreaming alone. Somewhere in the distance, faint and trembling, came a voice. Small, uncertain, "Rick?" It was Morty, or at least it sounded like Morty, like a child calling from under a blanket. Thin, muffled, yet so full of trust that Rick felt a pang in his chest. He froze, listening. Morty. His own voice faltered, softer than he intended. He cleared his throat, tried again, louder. "Morty, that you?" No answer came at first, only the slow exhale of the corridor itself, as though the very walls sighed in sympathy. Then, after a pause long enough for Rick to wonder if he'd imagined it, came the echo again. "Rick, I can't." The sound frayed away, lost in the rippling dark. Rick pushed forward. He didn't run. Something about this place made haste feel wrong, like shouting in a library or breaking still water with a stone. So he walked steady, hands brushing against the soft-lit edges of the corridor. Each step deepened the unease, though not in the way of danger. It felt instead like walking deeper into memory, like wandering into the folds of his own mind, where even he didn't usually go. He tried to reason it out, of course. Some experiment gone sideways, some psychic parasite, some trap he'd blundered into. His usual explanations rolled through his head like cards in a deck. Yet the tone of the place, its warmth, its quiet weight, undid the logic. For once it didn't matter how he'd gotten here. What mattered was that Morty was calling. Rick's steps slowed as the corridor widened into a hall. Above him stretched a ceiling without end, draped in something that looked like clouds drifting on invisible winds. Through them flickered stars, not the sharp points he knew so well from endless nights of travel, but softened, blurred, like memories of stars seen long ago. The voice came again. "Rick!" Closer now. So close that Rick thought if he reached out, he might brush Morty's sleeve. Yet the boy remained hidden, tucked somewhere just out of reach. Rick closed his eyes. He tried to orient himself, to steady his breathing. This isn't real, he wanted to say, but the words stuck, because it was real in a way deeper than science could explain. He had walked into a corridor where reality folded in on itself, and Morty was here waiting. He whispered back, softer than before. "I'm here, Morty, just hold on." The corridor shifted in response, the air trembling with quiet acknowledgement, as though the place itself had been listening, waiting for Rick to admit what he usually refused, that someone else's voice mattered more than his own. He moved again, though the space seemed endless. His body felt heavy but not tired, more like the heaviness of remembering something long forgotten, a truth too large to carry all at once. For a moment, he thought he saw Morty ahead, a small figure curled up, knees drawn to chest. But when Rick blinked, the image dissolved into a patch of light. He sighed, dragging a hand through his tangled hair. Why him, he thought? Why Morty, of all people, echoing through this dream? If this was his prison, why would Morty be inside? The answer came not as thought, but as sensation. A tightness in his chest loosening just a little. He didn't know why, but he was glad Morty was here, even if it was only a faint echo. "Don't go quiet on me now," Rick whispered, his voice more plea than command. "Not in here." The corridor brightened slightly. Not much, just enough for Rick to see that the path curved ahead. And from around that bend came the faintest glow, warm and unsteady, like a lantern carried by trembling hands. Rick squared his shoulders, though the gesture felt strange in this dream-soaked place. He had no portal gun, no flask, none of the props he usually clung to. Just himself, the echo of his grandson's voice, and the faint scent of coffee and stars, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He stepped toward the bend. The corridor hummed in quiet reply. Rick kept walking, following the faint glow around the bend. The corridor no longer seemed endless. It curved, it narrowed, then widened again like a lung expanding and contracting. Each step he took carried no echo, only the hush of fabric brushing against fabric, as though the floor itself were made of folded dreams. The glow resolved into movement. Shapes drifted in the distance, not walking so much as floating. They were thin, long-limbed, faceless. Lanterns swung gently from their hands, though these lanterns gave no flame. Instead, they flickered with tiny scenes, like old film reels projected in miniature. One lantern showed a birthday Rick barely remembered, a cake leaning to one side, a laugh he hadn't allowed himself to think of in years. Another lantern carried a quieter scene, Rick sitting alone at a desk. Long before Morty was born, his hands trembling as he tried to steady them with work. He froze, narrowing his eyes. Memories, not random dreams, not illusions, but his own history being carried away. Piece by piece, the figures whispered to one another in voices too soft to make out. He strained to catch the words, but they dissolved like mist before reaching his ears. The whispers weren't meant for him. They were the language of shadows curating stolen thoughts. Rick's instincts, honed from a lifetime of schemes and survival, screamed at him to act, to shout, to lunge, to rip those lanterns from their hands and shatter them. But here in this quiet corridor, action felt wrong. Loudness would collapse the fragile space, like slamming a door in a room full of sleeping children. So he watched. He noticed how careful the figures were. Each lantern was treated with reverence, cradled like something delicate. They weren't thieves in the way Rick usually thought of thieves. They weren't greedy. They were archivists, curators of his mind, selecting fragments to lock away deeper. Still, the unease pressed heavier against him. If they took enough, what would be left of him? His thoughts turned to Morty, to the faint echo he'd heard earlier. What if Morty's voice was caught in one of those lanterns? What if by the time Rick reached him, the boy would already be nothing but a flicker carried by strangers? The idea unsettled him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. He stepped closer. His foot brushed against the floor with the softness of a sigh, and one of the figures paused. It tilted its head, or what passed for a head, toward him. Its lantern swung, casting the memory of a sunny afternoon against the walls, Rick teaching a much younger Beth how to hold a screwdriver. Her smile so bright it pierced through the haze. Rick's throat tightened. He looked away, unwilling to linger. The figure studied him, then turned back as though deciding he wasn't important enough to notice. He almost laughed at that. Him, Rick Sanchez, dismissed like a shadow in his own mind. But the laugh stayed trapped in his chest, heavy as a stone. The corridor ahead opened wider, like a hall stretching into forever. More figures appeared, each carrying lanterns with fragments of his life. Some moments he recognized instantly. Others slipped past his recognition entirely. Scenes he must have forgotten decades ago. It reminded him of an attic filled with boxes, each labeled in a handwriting he barely remembered, each holding something he once swore he would never throw away. There was no urgency in how the figures moved. They weren't rushing. They were simply cataloguing in their own patient way, building a prison from his own past. Rick rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of it all pressing in. He wanted to demand answers, but he understood instinctively that words would not reach them. They weren't enemies he could debate or outwit. They were keepers of silence. Still, his scientist's mind spun, searching for a way through. If he couldn't fight them, maybe he could follow them. Maybe they would lead him closer to the echo of Morty's voice. So he moved carefully, trailing at a distance. His steps sounded like whispers in water, dissolving almost before they were born. As he walked, he noticed how the lanterns responded to his nearness. Some flickered brighter, as though eager to be seen again. Others dimmed, retreating, hiding themselves from him. He realized then that his memories weren't just being stolen. They were being weighed, judged, perhaps even reshaped. He whispered under his breath, not to the figures but to himself. This isn't just a dream. It's a heist. The word hung in the air, echoing faintly before dissolving into the hush. He thought of Morty again, of how the boy had sounded, afraid not of monsters, not of pain, but of forgetting who he was. Rick's chest tightened once more. He knew the feeling too well. The fear that your identity might scatter like dust, leaving nothing but fragments in someone else's hands. He clenched his fists, then forced them open. Violence wasn't the answer here. He sensed it deep in his bones. The only way forward was patience, observation, waiting for the right moment to slip past. The corridor darkened as the figures drifted further. Their lanterns swung gently, like fireflies leading the way deeper. Rick followed, careful not to draw attention. As he did, a strange thought settled into him. Maybe this was how memory worked all along. Maybe we are always leaving fragments behind, carried by unseen hands into hidden rooms we'll never open again. And maybe that was okay. Maybe forgetting was its own kind of mercy. But Morty's voice, faint, trembling, full of trust, broke through that thought like a crack in the dark. Forgetting might be mercy, but not if it meant losing Morty. Not if it meant losing the one voice that still called to him. Rick straightened, quiet resolve in his posture. The archivists could take what they wanted, but Morty was his anchor, his reminder of the heart beneath all the layers. And so he followed the drifting shadows, his steps like whispers in water, into the deeper hall of memory. The corridor narrowed again, tapering into a quiet passage that pulsed like the inside of a heartbeat. Rick slowed, pressing his palm against the wall of dim light. It was warm, not burning, not cold, just alive. He muttered to himself, half to ground his thoughts, half to reassure the silence. All right. If this is a dream inside a dream, then somewhere in here. He's waiting. He kept walking. The archivist figures had faded into the distance, their lanterns swallowed by shadow. Only the scent of their passage lingered, faint and metallic, like dust brushed off forgotten books. Rick followed the trail until the passage opened into a room. The chamber felt heavy with stillness. It wasn't large, smaller than his garage maybe, but it carried a sense of depth that stretched far beyond its walls. Curtains of cloud drifted lazily across the ceiling. A single chair sat in the middle, too plain for such a strange place. And in the chair, curled like a child dozing in class, was Morty. Rick's throat tightened before he could stop it. "Morty," he whispered. The boy didn't stir. His head lolled slightly, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. He looked younger somehow, not the awkward teenager Rick dragged across galaxies, but closer to a child. His hands were folded against his chest like he was protecting something fragile. Rick approached slowly, as if rushing might wake not only Morty, but the entire dream. He crouched beside the chair, studying the boy's face. Lines of unease flickered across it, like ripples disturbing the surface of still water. His lips moved, but the words were faint, almost soundless. Rick leaned closer. "Don't forget me." The words hit harder than Rick expected. Morty wasn't afraid of monsters or corridors or shadows. He was afraid of vanishing, of slipping so deeply into the dream layers that his own name might dissolve. Rick reached out, his hand hovering just above Morty's shoulder. For a long moment he hesitated. He wasn't used to gentleness. It felt foreign, like speaking a language he hadn't practiced in years. But he lowered his hand, resting it lightly as though touching glass. "I got you, Morty," he murmured. "You're not going anywhere." Morty stirred, eyelids fluttering though he didn't fully wake. His face relaxed a little at the sound of Rick's voice. A quiet exhale slipped from him, almost a sigh of relief. Rick sat back, letting the silence settle again. He realized his own chest felt looser, as if some invisible weight had shifted. It startled him that something so simple, his voice, his touch, could soothe another person so deeply. He thought of all the times Morty had followed him without question, even when fear was obvious in his eyes. How many times had Morty trusted him in places no one else would? And here, in this quiet, layered dream, the boy's trust felt even more fragile. Rick whispered, not entirely sure who he was speaking to, Morty himself or the dream itself. "You may not understand the words, kid, but you'll always understand the heart." The words lingered in the air, settling like a lullaby. For a moment it felt as though the whole chamber exhaled in agreement. Morty's lips moved again, forming no clear words this time. Rick leaned forward, listening, but all he caught was the tremor of breath. He frowned, his usual sharpness muted. "Don't worry about it. You don't need the words right now." He eased himself onto the floor beside the chair, sitting cross-legged like he hadn't done since he was young. The silence wrapped around them like a blanket. Rick studied the walls. They seemed alive, faint images shifting in and out of focus. One showed Morty standing at a school locker, shoulders slumped as kids passed him by. Another flickered with an image of Rick and Morty running through a starfield, Rick shouting something Morty couldn't quite hear. The scenes shifted too quickly to hold, dissolving before Rick could grasp them. This wasn't just Morty's dream. It wasn't just Rick's either. It was something shared, a woven fabric of memory and fear and trust. Rick rubbed his temples. "Figures," he muttered. "Even my subconscious can't keep things simple." He looked back at Morty. The boy's breathing had steadied, though a faint tremor still rippled through him now and then, like waves against a dock. Rick knew he couldn't stay here forever. This was just the first layer. If Morty was tangled in this one, there had to be deeper layers where the danger lingered. He had to move, had to descend further, but not without Morty. He touched Morty's shoulder again, firmer this time. "Come on, Morty, time to wake up, at least a little." Morty stirred, his eyes cracking open. They were glazed, distant, but they focused slowly on Rick. Recognition flickered there, faint but certain. "Rick?" Morty's voice was thin, uncertain, like a whisper from under heavy blankets. "Yeah, it's me," Rick said, softer than he intended. "You're not alone, Morty. I'm here." Morty blinked slowly, his mouth opening as if to say more, but no words came. Instead, he nodded once, trust shining faintly in his gaze. Then his eyes fluttered shut again, though his hand slid down from his chest, falling open toward Rick. Rick hesitated only a second before taking it. Morty's small hand was warm in his own, fragile yet grounding. "All right," Rick whispered. "We'll go together." The chamber responded, the walls rippling outward as though acknowledging their pact. The chair dissolved beneath Morty, leaving him floating gently, his hand still locked with Rick's. The air around them shifted, growing thicker, slower, like syrup pouring instead of water flowing. Rick knew what it meant. They were sinking, descending into a deeper layer. He tightened his grip on Morty's hand. The last flicker of light in the chamber whispered across his vision. A reminder, or maybe a promise. "You may not understand the words, but you'll always understand the heart." Rick nodded to no one in particular. "Yeah," he said softly. "That'll do." And together they drifted downward deeper into the dream. The descent was not a fall. It was slower than falling, softer as though the air itself carried them downward. Rick held Morty's hand, the boy's fingers twitching now and then, as if even in half-sleep he was afraid of losing his grip. Around them, the light bent and stretched, turning from pale silver to a gentler shade of dusk. The floor beneath them appeared without a sound, a surface of soft marble veined with drifting clouds. Rick steadied his feet and looked around. They stood in a corridor once again, but this one was different, less rigid, less sharp. The edges of the walls breathed in and out, like curtains stirred by invisible wind. Morty stirred beside him, his eyelids heavy but opening enough to glance at the surroundings. Where are we now?" His voice was groggy, far away. Rick exhaled, though his tone was gentle. "Deeper, another layer. Think of it like going downstairs in a house that never ends. Every floor gets quieter, slower, harder to tell what's real." Morty blinked, swaying slightly on his feet. "It feels heavy." "Yeah," Rick said. "That's the way of it. Time thickens here. Minutes can feel like hours, hours like days. And the deeper we go, the more the world forgets to wake up." Morty looked down the corridor, where strands of cloud drifted lazily across the path. They didn't float above. They hung directly in the hall like curtains waiting to be parted. When Morty reached out, his hand passed through the mist, leaving ripples of silver light that slowly settled again. Rick watched him, a faint crease in his brow. "Don't wander too far. This place, it doesn't like being rushed." They began walking. Their footsteps sounded muted, like shoes pressing into soft sand. The corridor widened, then narrowed, never quite staying the same shape for long. Some stretches seemed endless, stretching out like a dream that never resolves, while others folded in on themselves, forcing them closer together. Rick's mind kept circling the same thought, how familiar this felt. Not in a scientific way, not like equations he could pin to paper, but in a human way, like walking through a memory half forgotten. He glanced at Morty, who was rubbing his eyes with his free hand. "You all right?" Morty nodded faintly. "I think so, I don't know if I'm me here. It's like I feel like I'm shrinking." Rick slowed, crouching slightly so he could look Morty in the eye. The boy's gaze was hazy, but the fear was real. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Listen, Morty. Every dream is a room we once forgot to lock, and sometimes when you open it, you feel smaller. But you're still you. You're always you." Morty frowned as if trying to understand, then let out a shaky breath. "Okay, if you say so." Rick gave a single nod and stood again. He didn't say it aloud, but inside he repeated the thought. "You may not understand the words, but you'll always understand the heart." It was becoming more than a phrase, it was an anchor. The corridor opened into a wide hall. Here the clouds moved slower, almost frozen in place like painted veils across the air. A series of doors lined the walls, each one tall and heavy, their handles faintly glowing. Morty pointed to one. "What's behind them?" Rick tilted his head, considering. "Could be anything. Rooms we locked. Rooms someone else built. Doesn't matter. Not yet." He led Morty down the center of the hall, ignoring the doors that hummed softly as they passed. The hum was low, like a lullaby half remembered. The air grew thicker as they walked. Morty stumbled once, but Rick caught him by the arm before he fell. "Easy," Rick murmured. "Don't fight it. Just breathe with it. Let it be heavy and it won't weigh you down." Morty tried, inhaling slowly, exhaling even slower. His steps steadied. Rick felt a quiet relief at that. Teaching patience wasn't something he was used to, but here in these layered halls, patience seemed like the only weapon worth having. They reached another corridor branching off, narrower and darker. Rick hesitated, then guided Morty toward it. The walls here shifted constantly, bending inwards, then stretching away. The deeper they walked, the less certain Rick was of time. Seconds seemed to fold into each other. He couldn't tell if they had walked for minutes or for days. Morty tugged at his sleeve. "Rick, are we lost?" Rick shook his head. "Not lost. Just between. There's a difference." The corridor curved, opening into a chamber without walls. Above them stretched a sky that wasn't a sky at all, but a dome of drifting clouds lit by unseen stars. Below their feet, the floor dissolved into rippling reflections as though they walked upon a lake of mirrors. Morty gasped softly. His reflection stared back at him, younger than he was now, almost a child again. He bent down, touching the surface. The reflection reached up to meet him, but its eyes were distant, blurred. Rick pulled him gently away. "Don't linger. These reflections, they'll pull at you if you stare too long." Morty glanced at Rick. "Pull me where?" Rick didn't answer right away. His own reflection stared up at him, older than he was now, face lined with grief and something heavier. He forced himself to look away. "Nowhere you want to go." They kept walking. The mirrored floor rippled beneath their steps, sending waves across endless reflections. Rick could feel the pace of time slowing even further, as though each breath stretched into hours. Finally, the chamber began to dim, the mirrored floor shifting back into stone. The clouds parted slightly, revealing another corridor, narrower and darker still. Rick let out a slow breath. "We're getting closer. Layers within layers, Morty. Each one slower, thicker, softer. That's how this works." Morty shivered, though he stayed close to Rick's side. "How many layers are there?" Rick gave a faint smile, not unkind. "As many as we're willing to walk through. But don't worry, we'll find the way." And so they stepped forward again, hand in hand, into the deepening dream. The corridor grew darker as Rick and Morty walked, though it wasn't the darkness of night. It was the kind of dimness that came when a candle was almost out, leaving the world hushed, holding its breath. The air shifted, cooler now, touched by the faint smell of ash and paper. Rick slowed, sensing a change in the rhythm of the dream. "Stay close," he said quietly. Morty nodded, his hand tightening around Rick's sleeve. They moved carefully, and soon the shadows around them stirred. At first they seemed like ordinary silhouettes, wavering at the edges of the mist. But as Rick's eyes adjusted, he saw they were not empty. The figures carried lanterns, small orbs of flickering golden light. Their shapes were thin, tall, almost brittle. and their movements were slow, deliberate. They didn't walk so much as drift, as though pulled forward by invisible tides. The figures whispered to one another, voices too faint to catch fully. The sound reminded Morty of hearing a conversation through a wall, muffled, broken into syllables. But every now and then a word surfaced clearly. Memory. Take. E quietly. Rick frowned, tilting his head as he watched them. Dream thieves, he murmured. Not the gun-swinging kind, the quiet kind. They don't steal gold or jewels. They steal thoughts, moments, things you don't notice missing until years later. Morty shivered. Why would anyone want that? Rick sighed, a rare heaviness in his voice. Because memories are heavier than they look. To some they're treasure, to others they're weapons. The figures drifted past, their lanterns glowing brighter as they brushed near the walls. Each time the lantern light touched the stone, faint images flickered into being, scenes pulled from Rick's past. A workshop cluttered with half-built inventions. A field where a child once played. A night sky blurred by rain. Morty's eyes widened. Those are yours, Rick. Rick clenched his jaw. Yeah, they're searching. Trying to draw them out, pull them into those lanterns. Morty watched, trembling. What happens if they take them? They fade, Rick said. The memories vanish from me like they never happened. But they don't disappear completely. They live on in the lanterns, carried by thieves who don't understand them. A moment stolen, stripped of its meaning. Morty pressed closer, whispering, So what do we do? Do we fight them? Rick shook his head, his gaze steady on the drifting shadows. No, not here. Fighting would just make the dream break apart, and we'd get stuck in the pieces. This place. It's not built for battles. Then how do we stop them? Rick knelt, his hand brushing against the cloud-soft floor. His voice softened, almost tender. Not with anger. With patience. These shadows feed on fear. If we let fear grow, they'll follow it straight into us. But if we fold the fear small, like paper into a crane, they won't have anything to carry away. Morty tilted his head, confused. Fold fear into a crane? Rick looked at him with the faintest smile. You don't need to get it all at once, just try. When you feel scared, don't push it down and don't let it take over. Hold it, bend it, shape it into something gentle. That's how you carry it without breaking. Morty swallowed hard, trying to understand. He closed his eyes for a moment, clutching at the knot of fear in his chest. He imagined holding it in his hands, folding its edges one by one. The process was clumsy, awkward, but slowly the fear softened, smaller, lighter. When he opened his eyes, one of the shadow figures drifted close, its lantern glowing brightly. It bent toward Morty, whispering in that muffled voice. But the lantern dimmed suddenly, its light flickering out. The figure hesitated, then drifted away, empty-handed. Rick watched, impressed despite himself. See? Not so hard. Morty blinked at him. I think it worked. It did, Rick said, standing tall again. Doesn't matter if you fold it perfectly. What matters is you don't let the fear stay sharp. They walked on, the lantern figures continuing their slow patrol. None approached too closely now. Morty felt his chest steadier, though his legs still trembled. Rick stayed beside him, eyes always scanning, mind working quietly. After a long stretch of silence, Morty whispered, Rick, are they trying to take you away from me? Rick paused. The question landed heavier than he expected. He looked down at Morty, at the boy's tired eyes and fragile trust. Yeah, he said finally. They'd take me piece by piece if they could. But I'm not letting them. Not while you're here. Morty nodded and the two kept walking. The corridor narrowed again, the whispers of the dream thieves fading into the distance. Soon there was only silence, broken by the sound of their slow footsteps. Rick thought about what lay ahead. More layers, more shadows, more of himself reflected back at him. He knew the prison wasn't built by enemies alone. Parts of it came from him. But for now, as Morty walked beside him, hand brushing his sleeve, Rick allowed himself one rare thought. Maybe patience and not science was the key to getting them through. The air grew heavier, time stretching again, pulling them toward the next challenge. And with each step, the lantern light behind them faded, until the corridor was filled only with silence, clouds, and the steady rhythm of their breathing. The corridor narrowed again until it was little more than a thread of space, stretching forward into mist. Rick and Morty walked in silence, their steps softened by the cloud-like floor. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Morty's grip on Rick's sleeve hadn't loosened since the dream thieves had faded away, and Rick let him cling without a word. They walked. The air thickened, and then, without warning, the corridor opened into another hallway. It looked the same as the one they had just left. Same walls breathing faintly, same drifting curtains of cloud. They moved forward. After a dozen paces, another hall appeared. Again, the same. Morty blinked hard, looking behind them. The corridor stretched back in the same endless line. "Rick," he whispered, We've been here already." Rick stopped. He crouched down, running his fingers across the floor. It felt solid, but when he pressed harder... "Classic dream trap. Keeps you walking in circles until you forget you're walking at all." Morty's voice trembled. "What do we do?" "I don't want to stay here forever, Rick." Rick looked at him. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He could almost see the panic rising in him like water in a glass. If it spilled over, the loop would grow tighter, stronger. Rick knelt, placing his palm flat on the ground. He closed his eyes and whispered, his voice low, almost tender, "Forgive the moment and it will forgive you." Morty blinked. "What does that mean?" Rick kept his hand on the floor, his words patient. "These loops, they feed on resistance. The more you fight against the moment, the stronger it holds you. But if you forgive it, accept it, soften it, the loop has nothing to cling to." He opened his eyes, meeting Morty's. "So, Morty, don't panic. Don't force it. Just let the moment be what it is." Morty swallowed, still trembling. I'll try." Rick nodded, shifting closer so their shoulders touched. He closed his eyes again, breathing slowly, and guided Morty with a quiet voice. "Breathe in. Hold it, let it go. Forgive the walls for being the same. Forgive the floor for repeating. Forgive the moment for circling. Don't fight it. Just forgive it." Morty followed, his breath shaky at first but steadier with each one. The panic in his chest loosened, like a knot slowly untying. His eyes softened. Then slowly the air in the corridor shifted. The walls flickered, the ceiling rippled, and the floor beneath them sighed as though released from tension. The endless loop dissolved like mist touched by sunlight. Ahead, a single doorway opened, glowing faintly with warm light. Morty gasped softly. It worked." Rick stood, offering his hand. Morty took it without hesitation. Together they stepped toward the doorway. As they passed through, Morty looked back once. The hallways were gone. Only soft mist remained. "Rick," he whispered, "why did it let us go?" Rick glanced at him, his expression unreadable but his voice gentle. "Because we stopped trying to escape. Sometimes. So that's the only way out." The new corridor they entered was wider, calmer. The clouds drifting across the ceiling were thinner here, letting faint stars shine through. Their light was soft, steady like a promise. Morty leaned against Rick's side as they walked, his voice small but calmer. I don't think I could have gotten out without you." Rick squeezed his shoulder briefly, a rare gesture. "That's why I'm here, Morty. Loops are tricky. They make you forget there's always another door, but you don't have to find it alone." For a while they walked in silence, their footsteps slow and unhurried. The echoes of the loop faded behind them, leaving only the steady rhythm of breathing, the soft drift of clouds and the sense that for now they had moved a little closer to the heart of the dream. The air after the loop felt lighter, as if some invisible hand had loosened its grip. The corridor stretched ahead, neither endless nor short, simply enough to walk without fear of circles. Rick kept Morty close, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Both of them breathed more evenly now, as though the loop had taught them the rhythm of patience. The hall widened slowly until it became a chamber lit by no visible source. The walls glowed faintly, like parchment held up to the sun. Morty blinked, rubbing his eyes. "Where are we now?" Rick's reply was quiet, thoughtful, deeper still. "Players don't just hold traps, Morty. Sometimes they hold guides." Morty tilted his head. "Guides?" Rick didn't answer at first. His gaze fixed on the far end of the chamber, where a figure began to take shape. It wasn't sudden, not like a person walking in. It was slower, an outline rippling into being as though memory itself had decided to stand upright. The figure looked like Rick. Not the Rick Morty knew exactly, but older, softer somehow. His shoulders were less hunched from the weight of cynicism, his eyes less sharp with exhaustion. His hair was silvered but not with neglect, more like starlight had touched it. Morty gasped. "Rick, that's you." Rick's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only watched as the figure stepped forward. The older Rick, this mentor Rick, moved with calm certainty, each footstep soundless. When he reached them, he stopped and regarded the younger Rick with a gaze that held no judgment. Only quiet knowing. "You've come far," the mentor said, his voice deeper but gentle, like the echo of waves in a harbor. "But you'll need more than defiance to pass through what lies ahead." Morty stared, eyes wide. Is he real?" Rick let out a dry breath. "As real as anything in here." "Which means real enough." The mentor smiled faintly, looking at Morty now. "You've done well. Fear folded gently becomes strength." Morty blushed under the weight of the words, unsure how to respond. He turned to Rick, hoping for an explanation. Rick met his older self's gaze. For the first time, Morty saw something in Rick's expression he'd never seen before. Awe. And beneath that awe, sorrow. The mentor stepped closer, addressing both of them. "The shadows here are drawn to noise. The louder your fear, the faster they come. The louder your anger, the deeper you sink. To move forward, you must walk in silence like wind over glass." Morty frowned, nervous. I don't know if I can do that. I get scared too easy." The mentor knelt before him, placing a warm hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to banish fear. Only soften your steps so it doesn't echo. Even fear can walk quietly if treated kindly." Rick watched the exchange, his chest tightening. He wanted to scoff, to make a joke, but the words struck too deeply. He remembered all the times his own noise, his sharpness, his impatience had drawn shadows into Morty's life. The older version of himself seemed to know this too. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. Finally, Rick muttered, "So what, you're here to teach me how to tiptoe?" The mentor chuckled softly, a sound warmer than Rick expected from his own voice. "To teach you how to be still. You've run enough, Rick, you've fought enough. The prison you're in isn't broken by force. It opens by quiet." Morty looked between them, feeling the weight of the moment. "Rick, he's you, but kinda." Rick's mouth twitched. He wanted to deny it, but the truth sat heavy. "Yeah, Morty, he's me, or maybe who I could have been if I'd chosen different roads." The mentor didn't argue. He simply placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, mirroring the gesture he'd given Morty. The touch was steady, grounding. For a heartbeat, Rick almost leaned into it. Then the mentor stepped back. His form shimmered faintly, as though light were passing through it. "I cannot walk with you further. My presence would draw too much attention. But remember, silence can be a shield. When words fail, let stillness guide you." Morty swallowed, his voice soft. "Will we see you again?" The mentor smiled faintly, looking at him with affection. "In every quiet choice you make." And then, as gently as he had appeared, he faded. His outline dissolved into the chamber's light, until only the soft glow of the walls remained. For a long while, neither Rick nor Morty moved. Morty finally whispered, "Rick, are you okay?" Rick rubbed the back of his neck, staring at the space where his older self had stood. His voice was low, almost raw. "I don't know, Morty, I just saw a version of myself that doesn't hurt so much. That's hard to look at." Morty reached for his sleeve, tugging it lightly. He seemed proud of you." Rick huffed out a weak laugh, not quite able to believe it. "Yeah, well, pride doesn't last long in my world." But even as he said it, something in his chest loosened. Maybe, just maybe, the mentor's presence had left a mark. The chamber slowly shifted, opening a new passage ahead. The path was darker but less threatening somehow, as if silence itself was leading the way. Rick squeezed Morty's shoulder lightly. "Come on, let's walk quiet." Morty nodded, and together they stepped forward, their footsteps softer now, their breaths more in tune. The silence around them no longer felt empty. It felt like guidance. The passage stretched on, narrow and dim, as if the silence the mentor left behind had drawn them inward. The glow of the walls faded to a hushed twilight. Every step they took seemed to deepen the air, until even breathing felt like it belonged to the room, not to them. Morty kept glancing at Rick, sensing his unease. Rick's jaw was set tight, his eyes fixed ahead, but there was a heaviness in his movements that Morty could feel without words. The hallway opened suddenly into a vast chamber, circular and still. Its walls were not stone or dream stuff, but shifting liquid mirrors. Each surface shimmered with images that flickered like fragile film reels. As Rick and Morty stepped closer, the mirrors steadied into clear scenes. Morty gasped. He saw Rick, not the Rick beside him, but younger versions moments long past. Rick laughing with a woman who held his hand. Rick standing in a cluttered garage alone, staring at unfinished machines. Rick sitting in silence at a family table with an empty chair. Rick's eyes darted across the walls, then away, then back again, like a man unwilling to face his own reflection. His voice was low. "This place? This is a mistake." Morty stepped closer to one of the mirrors, mesmerized. In it, Rick was holding a baby. Morty couldn't tell who. But the look on Rick's face was soft, even tender. Morty whispered, "Rick, is that real?" Rick turned sharply. "Don't look too close, Morty, these aren't for you." But the chamber didn't listen. More mirrors stirred, showing flashes of mist laughter, doors closing on loved ones, long nights of quiet despair. Every regret Rick carried had been catalogued, woven into walls that refused to let him turn away. Morty finally looked at Rick, not the mirrors. You've been hurting a long time, huh?" Rick tried to scoff, but the sound caught in his throat. His hand went to the back of his neck, rubbing hard as if he could scrub away the memories. "Don't make it a therapy session, Morty, it's just dream garbage. Doesn't matter." But Morty didn't believe him. He stepped closer to Rick, his voice small but steady. "It matters to me." For the first time, Rick couldn't hold Morty's gaze. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. Around them, the mirrors slowed, no longer flashing but lingering, showing one moment again and again. Rick sitting at a table, head in his hands, a plate of untouched food cooling beside him. Morty swallowed hard. "You don't have to hide it. I can see it. Even if I don't understand everything you've been through. I see you." The words settled in the chamber like a blessing. Rick's chest rose and fell with uneven breath. His voice was rough. "You're just a kid, Morty. You shouldn't have to carry my mess." Morty shook his head. "I'm not carrying it. I'm just standing with you." The chamber seemed to listen. The mirrors softened, the images blurring as if given permission to fade. The walls glowed warmer, no longer accusing but releasing, like a tide going out. Rick lifted his eyes, surprised. He hadn't done anything, hadn't fixed it with a gadget or clever trick. It was Morty's quiet acceptance that had eased the weight. He glanced at Morty, who looked nervous but steady, his small hand still resting lightly against Rick's sleeve. For a fleeting moment, Rick saw the boy not as a sidekick dragged into chaos, but as a presence that grounded him, a tether in the storm. "Kid." Rick started, then stopped. Words failed him. Instead, he placed a hand over Morty's, pressing it gently. Morty's face softened, relief passing over him. He didn't need Rick to explain. The gesture was enough. Together they stood in the chamber, as the last of the mirrors dissolved into still light. The room no longer held images, only calm. Rick exhaled deeply, as though some locked part of him had finally loosened. After a long silence, Morty asked quietly, "Do you feel lighter?" Rick smirked faintly, though his eyes were wet. "Don't get used to me saying this, Morty. But yeah, a little." They turned toward a new doorway opening ahead, the path revealed not by force but by acceptance. Rick squeezed Morty's shoulder before letting go. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's see where the next regret wants to take us." Morty smiled faintly. "As long as we go together." The chamber closed behind them, its echoes fading into nothing but memory. The corridor after the chamber of regrets felt quieter than any space they had walked so far. Not the fragile hush of fear, nor the cautious silence of hiding, but something deeper, weightier, as if the air itself wanted to teach them how to listen. Each step Rick and Morty took was met with stillness so complete it seemed to absorb the sound before it could echo. They followed the narrowing passage until it ended at a vast gate. It was unlike any door Morty had seen. No hinges, no handles, no keyholes. The surface was smooth as glass and pale as moonlight, yet it pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Morty instinctively reached out a hand, but Rick stopped him with a gentle shake of the head. "This isn't a door you open with your hands," Rick murmured. His voice sounded strangely loud against the hush, and he lowered it again, almost to a whisper. "This is silence made solid, a barrier carved from everything unsaid." Morty's eyes widened. "So, how do we get through it?" Rick stared at the gate, frowning. His scientist's mind itched for a solution. Some formula, some gadget, some trick. But he knew deep down those tools were useless here. He pressed his palm against the cold surface, then pulled it back. No resistance, no lock, only stillness. Morty tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Maybe it's like the mentor said. Maybe we don't push. Maybe we just... Wait!" Rick almost scoffed, but the memory of his older self's steady voice lingered in him. Silence can be a shield. He sighed, lowering himself to the ground with a slow creak of his knees. He gestured for Morty to sit beside him. They sat cross-legged before the gate. The air was cool, almost sacred. Rick closed his eyes, awkward at first, restless, but then let himself breathe. Slow, deliberate breaths in and out. Morty mirrored him, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm. At first, the silence pressed on them, heavy and uncomfortable. Rick's thoughts scrambled, filling the quiet with noise, equations, memories, bitter remarks. But gradually, with each breath, the clutter dimmed. He focused on the simple presence of Morty's hand resting against his. Time slipped strangely, unmeasured. Minutes felt like gentle tides. Neither spoke, because words would have been too sharp for this place. The gate seemed to listen. Its faint pulse steadied, matching their breathing. Morty opened his eyes a crack and whispered, almost afraid to break the calm, "Rick, is it working?" Rick didn't answer right away. He simply squeezed Morty's hand lightly, and the boy understood. The gate began to shift, not by swinging open, not by breaking, but by softening. The surface rippled like water, dissolving into a mist that parted slowly, soundlessly. Beyond it, a passage unfurled, gentle as dawn. Morty's eyes filled with wonder. We did it," Rick exhaled, almost smiling, though his eyes carried a quiet awe. "We didn't do anything, Morty, that's the point. Sometimes stillness does what force never can." They rose together, stepping carefully through the threshold. The mist brushed against their skin like a blessing before fading behind them. On the other side, the air felt lighter, freer, yet filled with unspoken meaning. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was supportive, like the hand of an unseen friend resting on their shoulders. Morty glanced up at Rick, his voice soft. "I didn't know you could, be quiet like that." Rick chuckled under his breath, a low sound that almost passed for humility. "Don't spread it around, Morty. Ruins my reputation." But Morty smiled anyway, because beneath the jest he heard the truth. Rick had let go of control, even if just for a moment. And in that letting go, something precious had opened. The path ahead curved gently into shadow, waiting. Rick placed a hand on Morty's back, guiding him forward. The silence lingered with them like a companion, no longer something to fear, but something to trust. As they walked on, Morty whispered the words he remembered from earlier. "You may not understand the words, but you understand the heart." Rick didn't reply, but his grip on Morty's shoulder tightened, just enough to say everything without sound. The passage beyond the gate of silence narrowed again, its walls folding inward, like the throat of some vast sleeping creature. Rick and Morty walked without speaking, the quiet still clinging to their clothes like mist. Their footsteps were soft, but the further they went, the more the air grew dense, as if every breath had to push through layers of dream dust. At last, the corridor opened into a chamber, unlike any they had seen before. It was vast, circular, and shrouded in a dim light that seemed to come from nowhere. In the center stood a cage, not of bars or metal, but of shadow woven thickly as if the dark itself had learned to braid. The strands pulsed faintly, alive, and inside sat a figure that made Morty's chest tighten. It was Rick, or rather, another Rick, this one hunched, still, head bowed low. His hands rested on his knees, unmoving. His face was hidden in shadow, but Morty could feel the weight of his silence. All around the cage, shadowy figures drifted. They were softer than the thieves they had seen before, almost like monks, each carrying a lantern of dim flame. They did not move with malice. Instead, they circled slowly, chanting under their breath. Their words were too quiet to understand, but the rhythm was clear, a lullaby of sleep without waking, a song meant to keep Rick trapped forever. Morty clutched Rick's sleeve, whispering, "They're keeping you asleep, keeping you locked in." Rick's eyes narrowed, studying the cage. He didn't pull away from Morty's grip, not this time. His voice was rough but steady. "Here, but look closer, Morty. This wasn't built by them." Morty blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" It's a prison, right? Rick stepped nearer, his gaze fixed on the shadowed figure inside. His tone softened, almost breaking. No, kid, that cage, it's mine. I built it myself. Not with hands, but with fear. Fear of what happens if I let people close. Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, but deep down he knew Rick was telling the truth. The shadows weren't chaining him. They were only keeping the cage intact, feeding it with the rhythm of regret. They stood together in silence, listening to the soft chant. Morty's eyes burned with quiet sadness. So, you're saying you locked yourself away? Rick gave a faint, humorless laugh. That's the thing about cages, Morty. Sometimes they look like protection until you realize you're the one who can't get out. The shadows turned their lanterns toward Rick and Morty. Not threatening, not angry, just patient. Their glow made the cage shimmer, as if reminding Rick of his choice. Morty stepped closer, his voice trembling but firm. Then let me in there with you. If you're scared of love or being hurt or whatever it is, I don't care. I'll sit with you in the dark. You don't have to do this alone, Rick froze. For a long time he didn't answer. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, his eyes flickering between the cage and the boy beside him. Finally he whispered, Morty, you're too good for me. Morty shook his head. I'm just me, and I'm here. The words struck something deep in Rick. He stepped closer to the cage, and as he did, the shadows slowed their chant. The woven strands pulsed harder, resisting. But Rick didn't reach for gadgets or force. He placed his hand against the shadowed bars and whispered, I'm done hiding. The figure inside, the caged Rick, lifted his head. For the first time, Morty saw his face. It was tired, worn, but softened by something almost tender. Their eyes met, and in that moment the two Ricks seemed to share an understanding. The cage shivered. The strands loosened slightly, quivering like strings plucked by invisible fingers. The lanterns dimmed. Morty pressed closer, his voice barely audible. Rick, it's not them keeping you here. It's you. You can let go. Rick closed his eyes. He could feel it. The fear, the loneliness, the old belief that love was weakness. The cage had been his fortress, but it had also been his prison. And Morty's presence, fragile but real, was the key he had never allowed himself to use. With a long, steady breath, Rick pulled his hand back, and then simply let the fear drop. The cage unraveled. Slowly, silently, the strands of shadow unwound themselves, dissolving into mist. The figure inside faded, merging back into Rick himself. The lantern-bearing shadows bowed their heads, their chant softening into nothing before they too vanished into the dark. The chamber was empty now. Empty but lighter. Rick swayed slightly, as though the release had taken more from him than a battle ever could. Morty caught his arm, steadying him. Rick gave him a tired smile, faint but real. Guess I needed that. Morty smiled back, eyes wet. Told you. You don't have to do it alone. For a moment neither moved. They simply stood in the center of the chamber. The silence around them no longer heavy but gentle. Like a lull after storm. When the way forward revealed itself, a quiet archway glowing at the far end, Rick rested a hand on Morty's shoulder. His voice was softer than Morty had ever heard it. Let's get out of here, kid, and together they stepped forward, leaving the heart of the prison behind. The archway led them into a chamber that felt both immense and intimate, like standing inside a breath held for too long. The walls shimmered with shifting light, not mirrors this time, but fragile veils, each carrying fragments of memory. Rick and Morty walked slowly, their footsteps softened by the floor, which felt less like stone and more like woven fabric. The air was delicate, weighted with choice. Rick's shoulders slumped as he took it in. He already knew what this place was, though he hadn't wanted to admit it. The prison might have dissolved, but it hadn't vanished. Its residue lingered here, asking him one final question. Morty looked up at him, uneasy. Rick, why does this place feel heavier than the others? Rick exhaled, his voice low. Because this is where I have to decide, Morty. We can't leave unless I let go of something. The bars are gone, but the lock's still here. Morty's brow furrowed. Let go of what? Rick glanced around the chamber. The veils of memory shifted and flickered. Moments of his life, fragile and incomplete. Some glowed faintly with warmth, holding his daughter when she was young, listening to laughter he hadn't heard in years. Others burned cold, arguments, betrayals, nights so quiet they hurt. One veil in particular pulsed brighter than the rest. It showed Rick alone, sitting in a chair, a drink untouched beside him, the silence pressing in like walls. His face was pale with exhaustion, his eyes empty. Morty followed his gaze and swallowed hard. That one. It hurts to look at, Rick's throat tightened. That's because it's the memory I've clung to the hardest. Loneliness. I've worn it like armor for so long I don't even know what I'd be without it. Morty stepped closer, his voice trembling. But if it's hurting you, then maybe it's not really armor. Maybe it's just chains. Rick's jaw flexed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to argue, to push the thought away with a sarcastic remark, but the truth rang too loud. He stared at the memory, his own face staring back from a prison of silence. The chamber seemed to listen, waiting. The veil swayed gently, urging him toward the choice. Rick's voice cracked as he whispered, "If I let go of this, if I stop clinging to loneliness, then everything changes. No more excuses. No more hiding." Morty stepped closer, tugging his sleeve. "Rick, you don't have to hide anymore. You've got me. You've always had me." Rick looked down at him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he believed it. He turned back to the glowing veil. His chest tightened as if part of him were being torn out, but he reached for it anyway. His hand touched the memory and it burned, not with pain, but with the weight of every night he had carried it. Then he breathed and released it. The veil dissolved in his hand, breaking apart like mist under sunlight. The chamber shuddered softly, not collapsing but opening. The weight in the air lifted, replaced by something gentler, freer. Morty's eyes widened, relief flooding his face. "How you did it, Rick. You let it go." Rick stood motionless for a moment, his chest heaving, his eyes wet. He wiped at them roughly, muttering, "Don't make a big deal out of it, Morty." But Morty didn't argue. He simply smiled, knowing that behind Rick's gruffness was a shift so profound it needed no words. The veils around them dimmed one by one, until only soft light remained. A path appeared ahead, not sharp or rigid, but unfolding naturally, like a road in a dream that had always been there. Rick placed a hand on Morty's back and whispered, "Come on, kid. We're not done yet." Morty nodded, but before they stepped forward, he looked up at Rick one last time. "Hey, Rick, yeah?" "I'm glad you chose me over the loneliness." Rick's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Yeah, Morty." "Me too." They walked forward together, the chamber fading behind them, carrying nothing but presence, leaving loneliness behind like an old shell finally set down. The path that unfurled before them felt lighter than any they had walked so far. No twisting corridors, no heavy gates, no mirrors filled with grief, only a soft incline that seemed to breathe with each step. The air shimmered faintly, and Morty noticed how time itself seemed to move differently here. A cloud drifted backward across the ceiling, folding itself into nothing. A lantern flickered into being, and then quietly vanished. Rick kept one hand on Morty's shoulder as they climbed. His chest still felt raw from what he had left behind, but that rawness no longer weighed him down. Instead, it made space. Space for the boy walking beside him. Space for the silence that no longer felt like punishment. Morty looked around, wide-eyed. "Rick, are we really leaving? Like, for real?" Rick gave a low hum. "Looks like it, Morty. But leaving a dream isn't like leaving a room. It's like surfacing from water. The deeper you were, the slower the rise. We've still got a ways to go." Morty nodded, watching as the walls around them shimmered and folded. The dream layers they had traveled through began to collapse behind them, not violently but gracefully, as though bowing out of existence. Hallways folded into themselves, staircases curled into clouds, and then the shadows appeared again. Not the threatening thieves they had once feared, but softer now, like silhouettes of forgotten companions. Each one still carried a lantern, though their flames burned dim. As Rick and Morty passed, the shadows lowered their heads as though offering quiet respect. Morty whispered, "They're not chasing us anymore." Rick studied them, his expression unreadable. "No, Morty. They were never really enemies. They were just reminders, echoes of what I was scared to face." The shadows stepped aside, letting them pass. Their lanterns flickered once, then dimmed into nothing, leaving only a lingering warmth in the air. As they continued, the incline grew steeper, and the sensation of rising became stronger. Morty felt as though his feet were lighter, his body almost weightless. It's like we're floating up instead of walking. Rick gave a faint smile. That's how you know you're waking up. Dreams don't hold you down once you stop fighting them. Clouds rolled across the passage, not descending this time but lifting upward as though making way for them. Morty reached out and brushed one with his fingertips. It was soft, cool, and it left a faint glow on his skin before fading. He turned to Rick, voice hushed. Do you think we'll remember this when we wake up? Rick didn't answer right away. His gaze was distant, fixed on the dissolving horizon ahead. Finally he murmured, not all of it. Dreams don't like to be remembered whole, but the important parts, the ones that matter, they stick. Morty nodded slowly, comforted. They walked in silence for a while, letting the dream collapse gently around them. Then, as if carried on the air, the words from earlier returned, unbidden, echoing softly through the space. You may not understand the words, but you understand the heart. Morty froze, eyes wide. Rick, did you hear that? Rick smirked faintly. Yeah, Morty. Guess even the dream wants us to remember. The words repeated once more, softer this time, blending into the rhythm of their footsteps. Morty felt his chest warm with the memory of saying them, of seeing Rick's guarded heart soften just enough to let him in. At last, the path leveled out. Ahead was a doorway of light. Not harsh, not blinding, but gentle like dawn through half-closed blinds. The edges shimmered, waiting. Morty clutched Rick's sleeve, suddenly nervous. What if we don't make it? What if something pulls us back? Rick knelt slightly so they were eye level. His voice was calm, steady. Then we climb again, Morty, but right now, this is the way out, and we're going together. Morty nodded, reassured. Though he still held tight, Rick stood, guiding him forward. With each step toward the doorway, the dream folded faster behind them. Clouds rolled back into themselves. The silence hummed like a lullaby. The last of the shadows bowed low, then faded completely. When they reached the threshold, Morty looked up at Rick one last time. We're really waking up. Rick gave him a rare, gentle smile. Yeah, kid. Time to rise. And with that, they stepped through the light together. The light carried them upward like a tide, not rushing, but slow and deliberate, as though the dream wanted them to savor its final notes. Rick and Morty emerged into a space that felt both vast and intimate, a horizon that was neither sky nor land, but something in between. The colors were muted pastels, drifting like watercolor spilled into water. Morty blinked, his hand still gripping Rick's sleeve. Are we almost awake? Rick scanned the horizon, his face unreadable but calm. Close enough. This is the surface layer, the place where the dream thins. From here we either rise or we fall back. The thought made Morty's stomach twist. He glanced around nervously. The dream was dissolving, edges of the horizon fraying like old paper. Fragments of clouds folded into silence. Echoes of voices drifted and vanished before he could catch the words. For a long moment Morty was quiet. Then with sudden heaviness he asked, Rick, what if I'm just part of the dream? What if none of me is real, and I just disappear when you wake up? Rick turned to him, startled by the tremor in his voice. Morty's eyes were wide, shining with fear that was too big for a boy his size. His shoulders hunched as though bracing for an answer he didn't want to hear. Rick sighed softly, kneeling so they were eye level. He reached out, steadying Morty with both hands on his shoulders. His voice was quieter than Morty had ever heard it, softer than science, lighter than sarcasm. Morty, even if you are just a dream, you're the best part of it. The words settled into Morty's chest, like warmth spreading through cold air. His fear eased, though his eyes stung with tears. He nodded slowly, clinging to Rick's sleeve, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to hold on to the moment. Rick gave a faint, crooked smile, his eyes glimmering with something almost fragile. Dream or not, kid, you matter. You've always mattered. Don't let this place tell you otherwise. The horizon pulsed gently, as if responding to Rick's words. The frayed edges of the dream folded inward, guiding them toward a soft archway of light. The path shimmered like rippling water, beckoning them closer. They walked together, Morty's hand still curled into Rick's coat. The dream wavered around them, now more fragile than ever. Memories flickered briefly in the mist. The corridor of regrets, the gate of silence, the cage of fear. Each appeared for a heartbeat, then dissolved as though bowing goodbye. Morty whispered almost to himself, "It's all going away." Rick squeezed his hand gently. "That's what dreams do, Morty, they fade. But the feeling they leave behind, that stays. You'll carry it without even realizing it." As they neared the archway, the air grew warmer. Morty could feel his eyelids growing heavy. The strange paradox of nearing wakefulness while feeling sleepier than ever. He leaned against Rick, who steadied him without hesitation. They paused just before the light. Morty looked up at him one last time, searching his face. "Promise me, Rick, when we wake up, you'll still be like this. Not cages, not silence, just you and me." Rick's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Yeah, Morty, I promise. Might screw it up, but I'll try." That was enough. Morty smiled faintly, his eyelids drooping. Rick brushed a hand over his hair, awkward but tender, then guided him forward. Together they stepped into the light, leaving the thinning dream behind. The horizon folded in on itself, whispering its final lullaby. You may not understand the words, but you understand the heart. And with that, the dream released them. The light gave way not to thunder, nor to the tearing sound of worlds splitting apart, but to something gentler. Rick's eyes blinked open in the half-darkness of his garage. The hum of his machines was faint, like an old lullaby played too softly to disturb the night. He sat in his chair, head heavy, body slack, as though he had been drifting for centuries. The weight of the dream still pressed against his chest, but only lightly, like the memory of a long embrace. He turned his head slowly. Beside him, Morty stirred. The boy had slumped against the side of the workbench, cheek pressed to his arm. His breaths came in even rhythms, soft and human, grounding the air with their steady reassurance. The faint dawn light slanted through the blinds, painting stripes of pale gold across his face. Rick watched him for a moment longer than he intended. In the dream, Morty had been both child and anchor, both guide and student. Here awake he was just Morty, messy-haired, a little awkward, fragile in his own ways. But Rick saw him differently now, not as an interruption to his experiments, not as a burden, but as a presence he had nearly lost to shadows. The garage was quiet. No alarms blared, no intruders lingered in the corners. There were no shattered fragments of machines or collapsing ceilings. The mind prison had ended not with explosions, but with a breath, a pause, a return to what had always been waiting. Morning. Rick leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. He expected the sharp edge of loneliness to stab him the way it always had after nights like this. But instead, there was only a softer ache, an emptiness that didn't feel like a wound. It felt like space, like a place that could be filled. Morty shifted slightly in his sleep, mumbling incoherently. Rick couldn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. He understood the heart behind them, and it was enough. The blinds creaked as the wind stirred outside. Sunlight grew a little stronger, chasing away the blues of night. Dust floated lazily in the golden shafts. The world felt hushed, as though holding back noise just for them. Rick rose quietly, stretching out the stiffness from his body. His knees cracked, his shoulders rolled. He glanced at Morty again and hesitated. For a second he considered waking him, just to say something to reassure him that the dream had ended. But he stopped himself. Morty looked peaceful, and peace was a rare enough thing to preserve. Instead, Rick grabbed an old lab coat from the back of his chair and draped it gently over Morty's shoulders. The boy stirred, sighed, and settled deeper into sleep. Rick turned back to his desk. His notebook sat there, scattered with equations and sketches. He picked one up and stared at the scribbled pages. Normally, the site would spark new calculations, new experiments, new escapes. But now the lines blurred, the urgency softened. He set it down again, untouched. He walked to the small window by the garage door. Outside, the world was waking, birds stretching their wings, the faint rumble of cars in the distance, the soft stirring of leaves in the breeze. Ordinary life, unfolding with quiet certainty. For once, Rick didn't feel the need to run from it. He pressed a hand lightly against the window pane, the glass cool against his skin. He thought of the veils of memory, the cage built from his own fear, the loneliness he had finally set down. He thought of Morty's hand in his, small and steady, guiding him out of the shadows. There was no dramatic revelation, no triumphant surge. Just a quiet understanding, a soft truth. He didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. Behind him, Morty's breathing remained steady, syncing with the rhythm of the garage's machines. Rick closed his eyes and let the sounds fold around him. No battles waited, no dreams demanded, only the stillness of morning, the warmth of presence, and the fragile peace of return. When he opened his eyes again, the light had shifted. The day had begun. The days that followed unfolded not like revelations, but like the slow opening of blinds to morning light, quiet, steady, unremarkable to anyone else, yet filled with meaning for those who noticed. Rick did not speak of the dream, and Morty did not ask. Still, its echoes lingered between them in gestures too small for words. On the first morning after, Morty remembered only fragments. A corridor that smelled of clouds, shadows carrying lanterns, a cage that wasn't quite a cage. He frowned into his cereal, spoon hovering mid-air. "Rick, did we go somewhere last night?" he asked softly. Rick, hunched at the counter with a cup of coffee, didn't look up. "Dreams, Morty, they're sticky like that. Don't get too hung up on them." His voice was casual, but his hand lingered on the mug longer than usual, as though holding on to its warmth. Morty let it drop, though the fragments kept tugging at him. He would wake at night with the faint memory of Rick kneeling beside him, whispering words he couldn't recall, only the feeling, safe, cared for. Understood. In the afternoons, when school ended, Rick sometimes surprised him. Instead of disappearing into the garage for hours, Rick would linger at the kitchen table. He'd listen, half distracted, half amused, as Morty recounted the monotony of his day. For Morty, it mattered more that Rick stayed than what he said. The presence itself was a gift. Other days, Rick would retreat to his garage, but even there something subtle had shifted. The chaos of inventions remained, but the urgency had softened. He tinkered not to escape, but to pass time, humming softly as he worked. Occasionally, Morty found him paused, staring at nothing, as though listening to echoes only he could hear. One evening, Morty brought 2 sandwiches, clumsy, uneven, stuffed with whatever they could find in the fridge. He set one beside Rick without a word. Rick raised an eyebrow, about to comment on the mess of mustard dripping from the edge, but instead, he just took a bite. They ate in silence, the kind that doesn't ache. Rick chewed thoughtfully. Morty kicked his feet nervously against the stool, and between them stretched a quiet companionship. It wasn't heroic or dramatic, but it was real. When Morty went to bed that night, he thought about how different Rick's eyes looked lately. Still sharp, still restless, but softer at the edges, like they'd stopped bracing for a blow. Morty couldn't explain why that change mattered so much, but he felt it deep in his chest. Rick, left alone in the garage, stared at the empty sandwich plate. He muttered something about mustard ratios, but his lips curved almost imperceptibly. He leaned back in his chair, not rushing into equations, just letting the moment linger. The days after the dream did not erase Rick's habits. He still drank, still grumbled, still lost himself in projects that stretched late into the night. Yet beneath all of that, Morty sensed a thread of gentleness that hadn't been there before. When Rick placed a hand on his shoulder to guide him through a crowd, or paused before speaking as though weighing the words, those small things glowed brighter than any invention. Morty carried the fragments quietly, uncertain if they were dreams or memories. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was how he felt now, seen, valued, tethered to someone who usually drifted too far. And Rick, though he never said it aloud, carried something too. The memory of a cage undone not by genius but by letting go. The memory of Morty's voice steadying him in silence. The days after were not spectacular. They were ordinary, maybe even forgettable. Yet in their ordinariness, something sacred unfolded. Life shared without the weight of prisons or shadows. It was enough. The bond between them did not arrive with trumpets or declarations. It unfolded in small, almost invisible gestures, the kind that only reveal themselves when strung together across quiet days. Rick and Morty did not speak of the dream, but they lived as though it had whispered something into their bones that couldn't be forgotten. Morty noticed first in the mornings. When he shuffled into the kitchen, hair sticking out in uneven tufts, Rick was sometimes already there, half asleep with a cup of coffee. Before, Rick would bark about hurry-ups or ignore him entirely. Now occasionally, he'd slide the sugar bowl a little closer to Morty without a word, as though anticipating the boy's clumsy reach. It wasn't much. But to Morty it was everything. At school, Morty carried himself differently too. The fragments of the dream lingered, giving him a subtle confidence. When classmates teased, he didn't shrink as quickly. Somewhere in his heart, he heard Rick's quiet voice reminding him, "Even if you're only a dream, you're the best part of it." The words became armor, softer than steel but stronger than anything he'd known. Rick noticed Morty's small changes, though he didn't say so. Instead, he let Morty sit beside him in the garage more often. Sometimes Morty watched him solder wires or recalibrate strange devices. Other times they sat in silence, each lost in thought but not in isolation. Rick had lived so long inside his own head that silence had always meant loneliness. Now with Morty nearby, silence carried something else. Trust. One late afternoon, they shared sandwiches again. Rick had slapped together 2 uneven stacks of bread and cheese, careless as ever. Morty grinned at the lopsided creation, mustard spilling from the edge. "You're really bad at making sandwiches, Rick," he said softly. Rick raised an eyebrow, but instead of snapping back, he smirked. "Yeah, well, genius doesn't extend to condiments, kid." They ate together, the quiet stretching between bites. Morty chewed slowly, savoring the ordinariness. Rick, though, kept sneaking glances at him, little checks as though making sure Morty was really there, not some leftover echo of the dream. Later that night, Morty found himself unable to sleep. He padded into the garage and found Rick still awake, hunched over a glowing blueprint. For a moment, Morty just stood in the doorway, watching. Rick looked older like this, shoulders heavy, but there was also a softness in the way he leaned back when he finally noticed Morty. "Can't sleep, huh?" Rick asked, his voice quieter than usual. Morty shook his head. "Just didn't want to be alone." Rick hesitated. Normally he might have teased or brushed the words aside, but tonight he only gestured to the stool beside him. "Then don't be." Morty sat resting his arms on the workbench. They didn't talk much after that, only listened to the hum of machines and the occasional scratch of Rick's pen. For Morty it was enough. For Rick, it was something more, a recognition that letting someone stay close didn't weaken him. It steadied him. Over the days that followed, the rhythm deepened. Morty trusted Rick more openly, leaning on him not just in danger but in ordinary moments. Rick, in turn, allowed Morty glimpses of his vulnerability, pauses, sighs, and half-finished thoughts that carried more truth than any invention. Once, as dusk painted the sky with fading rose and gold, Rick caught Morty staring up at the stars. The boy's face glowed with awe, innocent and unguarded. Rick followed his gaze, and for the first time in a long while he didn't see the stars as data points or navigational markers. He saw them as Morty did, beautiful, distant, eternal. He reached out almost without thinking and rested a hand gently on Morty's shoulder. Morty didn't flinch. He only smiled faintly, leaning into the gesture as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic shifts. Just 2 lives brushing more closely together, stitched by ordinary days, softened by trust, and in that quiet, their bond grew. Not heroic, not loud, but tender. The days slipped quietly into one another, each leaving behind a faint shimmer of change that Rick barely acknowledged, though he felt it all the same. Morty was sleeping more easily now, shoulders less tense, laughter returning in small bursts. The boy carried something lighter in him, though he didn't know why. Rick, too, carried something, but it was subtler, heavier, more private. One evening, as twilight stretched its soft colors across the sky, Rick found himself alone. The garage was dark except for the faint blue glow of instruments, left humming in standby. He stood at the door that opened to the backyard, a glass in his hand, condensation slipping lazily down its side. The drink inside was half forgotten, its surface barely stirred. He watched the horizon. The sun had just dipped, leaving behind streaks of purple and faded orange, as if the world had been brushed by tired hands. Stars peeked through slowly, shy at first, then bolder, sprinkling the sky with their quiet persistence. Rick leaned against the doorframe, shoulders heavy, gaze far away. It was here in the twilight hush that the fragments of the dream returned most vividly. He remembered the veils of memory, the cage that pulsed with his fear of love, the endless corridors scented with starlight and coffee, and Morty's hand, always Morty's hand, pulling him onward when he might have chosen to stay behind. Rick lifted the glass to his lips, but didn't drink. Instead, he stared into it. The liquid reflected the faint glow of stars, warped and trembling, as though the universe itself had been poured into his hand. He chuckled under his breath, though the sound lacked its usual edge. Figures. Infinity in a cup. He tilted the glass, letting the stars blur, then lowered it again. For so long his mind had been his fortress, a place filled with traps, codes, and shields. He had built it high to keep out pain, only to trap himself inside. The dream had shown him that plainly, yet standing here in the quiet, he wondered if he had truly left it behind. "Am I awake?" he muttered, "or just another layer down?" The twilight offered no answer. Only the wind stirred, rustling through the trees. Rick sighed, leaning his head against the frame. He thought of Morty again, of the boy's nervous grin, his stubborn loyalty, the way his small voice had anchored him when silence threatened to smother. Rick had walked through galaxies, through dimensions stacked like cards, but none of it had struck him the way Morty's whispered, "I still see you" had. He closed his eyes, letting the memory soften him. It was strange being seen, strange and terrifying and quietly beautiful. The stars grew brighter as night deepened. Rick opened his eyes and tilted the glass, finally taking a sip. The burn was familiar, but tonight it didn't numb him. Tonight it only reminded him that he was alive, sitting at the edge of something he didn't fully understand. He lowered the glass and exhaled slowly. His reflection in the window was faint, half-shadowed, half-illuminated. For once he didn't look away. He studied his own face as though it were a stranger's, lined, weary, but softened in the twilight. He almost saw the mentor figure from the dream, older, kinder, a version of himself he had always resisted becoming. Maybe, he thought, that reflection wasn't a stranger at all. The thought startled him. He shook his head, muttering something about sentimentality, but the warmth lingered anyway. For a long time, Rick simply stood there, letting the sky shift overhead. He didn't try to solve it, didn't chase it into equations. He let it be what it was, a moment. And as twilight deepened into night, Rick felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but unburdened just enough to breathe. Years passed, not in leaps or battles, but in the steady unfolding of ordinary days. Morty grew taller, his voice deeper, his steps more certain. Rick remained much the same in appearance, though lines deepened around his eyes, and his movements carried the faint stiffness of years. What changed most was not what could be measured, but what lingered unseen. The dream, that quiet labyrinth of corridors and cages, never fully left Morty. He rarely spoke of it, perhaps fearing that words would shatter its fragile truth, but it lived in him, shaping the way he remembered his grandfather. When Morty thought of Rick, he did not think first of wild inventions or chaotic journeys. He thought of a moment in silence, a hand on his shoulder, a voice rough yet gentle telling him that even if he were only a dream, he was the best part. That memory, more than galaxies or gadgets, defined Rick's place in his heart. Sometimes, as an adult, Morty would find himself drifting through the world with that phrase echoing quietly in his chest. In crowded rooms, in lonely apartments, in the stillness of late nights, he carried it like a secret compass pointing him back to belonging. Rick never asked if Morty remembered. He seemed to know. Instead, he left reminders in subtler ways. A sandwich shared without commentary, a moment of stillness beneath the stars, a rare unguarded smile when Morty laughed too hard at something trivial. Each gesture said in its own language, "I see you. I'm still here." As the years layered, Morty learned that this was Rick's legacy. Not machines that rusted, not formulas scribbled in notebooks, not chaotic tales whispered in half-truths. The legacy was presence. The legacy was the quiet knowledge that, at least once, Rick had let himself be vulnerable. And in doing so had taught Morty the strength of tenderness. There were times Morty missed him, even while sitting beside him. Rick often disappeared into himself, lost in thought or drink. But Morty no longer mistook that for abandonment. He knew the difference now between loneliness chosen and loneliness endured. He knew that even in silence, Rick's care stretched toward him like a tether. One autumn evening, long after twilight had fallen, Morty sat outside alone. The air smelled faintly of leaves and distant smoke. He tipped his head back, staring at the stars scattered above, and felt Rick's presence as surely as if he were still at his side. He whispered into the quiet, not expecting an answer. "You're still here, aren't you?" And in the hush of night, Morty thought he heard the faintest reply, like a shadow of breath. "Always, kid." The memory of the dream had aged with him, softening at the edges, becoming less of a story and more of a feeling. He never told it as an adventure. He never described it with lantern shadows or endless corridors. Instead, he remembered it as a time he felt truly seen. A time when his grandfather's guarded heart had opened just enough to let him in. That was the inheritance Rick left behind. Not a blueprint, not a weapon, not a machine, but the certainty that connection, even fragile and fleeting, mattered more than anything else. And Morty carried that legacy forward, not in grand speeches, but in the way he held space for others, in the way he stayed present when silence grew heavy. It was the quiet torch Rick had passed, glowing faintly, endlessly. Sleep came to Rick more gently than it once had. Where his nights had once been filled with jolts of half-waking panic, heavy drinking and restless muttering, there was now a softer rhythm. He still dreamed strangely. His mind was too tangled to ever give him simple rest, but the weight of those dreams no longer felt like punishment. One night, drifting beyond the reach of equations and regrets, Rick found himself walking again through a corridor. But this was not the old prison of twisting shadows and endless locks. It was quiet, bathed in a pale light that seemed to hum like a distant song. The walls did not close in. They expanded outward, like the slow inhale of a universe at peace. Rick glanced down at his hands. They were steady. No chains, no trembling, no traces of the loneliness he had once clung to as armor. He flexed his fingers, then reached out to touch the wall. Instead of cold stone or flickering veils, it felt like starlight woven into fabric, soft, endless, welcoming. He walked. His footsteps echoed lightly, not ominous but soothing, like a heartbeat carried through the floor. Above him, faint stars shimmered along the ceiling as though the corridor itself had borrowed the night sky. And then, without meaning to, Rick began to hum. The melody was simple, something half-remembered from the dream. A lullaby that had wound its way through the corridors of his mind prison. The words were gone, but the tune carried enough. It was gentle, repeating. A small song meant not for grandeur, but for rest. "Sleep, gentle spark." "Rest," he murmured, barely more than a breath. The corridor seemed to lean closer, listening. The stars overhead pulsed faintly in rhythm with the tune. Rick's voice faltered for a moment, then grew steadier. He hadn't sung anything in years, hadn't trusted his voice to carry something fragile. But here, in this dream place, it felt right. As he moved, he noticed that the hallway was no longer empty. Shapes flickered at the edges, not threatening but familiar. He thought he saw Morty's small silhouette, drifting peacefully ahead of him, like a boy wandering without fear. Behind him, echoes of people he had loved, faces softened, not sharp with regret. They didn't speak. They only listened to the hum of the lullaby. Rick's chest tightened. It wasn't sorrow exactly, and it wasn't joy either. It was something in between, a recognition of how much he had carried and how much he could finally set down. He kept humming, each note steady, filling the silence without breaking it. The corridor stretched onward, but he no longer wondered where it ended. It wasn't about escape or answers or survival. It was about walking, singing softly, being present. For the first time in his long, tangled life, Rick dreamed not of prisons, not of chaos, but of peace. The lullaby belonged to no one, yet it felt like it had been waiting in him all along. He closed his eyes as he walked, letting the tune guide him. In the darkness behind his eyelids, stars continued to glow. He thought of Morty, of the boy's hand in his, of the way he had whispered, "I still see you." That memory was no longer heavy. It was light, like a lantern carried in the palm. Rick whispered into the corridor, almost embarrassed, but not enough to stop. "Rest easy, kid. Wherever you are." The corridor answered only with silence, but it was the kind of silence that holds, that comforts, that hums back without words. Rick walked until he felt no need to walk further. He let himself rest against the wall of starlight, still humming the lullaby under his breath. His eyes closed again, this time not in exhaustion but in surrender to calm. The dream held him gently, not to trap him, but to cradle him. And Rick, who had spent a lifetime resisting rest, finally allowed it. The dream faded slowly, not with a jolt, but with the kind of drifting that comes at the edge of sleep. Rick lay back against the imagined wall of stars, and as the corridor dissolved, he felt no loss. Instead, there was warmth, a sunlight that seemed to arrive without a source, filling the space where shadows once lingered. He stretched out on what might have been grass, or the floor of some remembered meadow, or nothing at all. Only the softness of being held by something larger than himself. Morty was there. Not loud, not afraid, not questioning. Just nearby. The boy sat cross-legged, leaning back on his palms, eyes half closed as though he were napping with his eyes open. Neither spoke at first. Words weren't necessary here. Their breathing was enough, a rhythm that matched the quiet pulse of the dream around them. Rick glanced over at his grandson and studied the curve of his shoulders, the gentleness of his face in the golden glow. He thought of how many times he had dragged Morty through impossible situations, and how many times Morty had surprised him by enduring, by forgiving. And now here in this place where time did not rush or demand, Rick felt only gratitude. "You know, kid," Rick said softly, "I spent so much of my life thinking I had to outsmart everything. Every problem, every trap, every damn memory. But maybe the smartest thing I ever did was just let you sit with me." Morty tilted his head but didn't answer. His smile was small but real, and Rick felt the words land even without reply. The imagined sun warmed them both. Rick stretched his arms wide, wider, until it felt like he could touch the edges of the sky. It wasn't the stretch of invention or escape this time. It was the stretch of release, of loosening knots that had pulled tight for decades. His fingers brushed the edges of light, and he laughed under his breath, not bitter, not cynical. Just a soft laugh, like a sigh. And somewhere, he thought, I'm still drifting, napping in the sun. The corridor, the prison, the dream, all of it had folded into this moment. A moment without need to run or solve. Just presence. Just rest. The narrator's voice, warm and low, lingers now, wrapping around the listener as though speaking directly into their tired heart. This is how it ends. Not with alarms, not with battles, but with a quiet exhale. Rick and Morty side by side at peace. And maybe that's all the legacy anyone truly leaves. The memory of being seen, being cared for, being close enough to hear the breathing of someone who matters. The dream does not close sharply. It fades like the last note of a lullaby, still vibrating in the air even after the sound has gone. The listener feels it more than hears it. So the story rests here. A man who once built cages of his own mind, who once drowned himself in inventions and escape routes, finally allowed himself to nap beneath imagined sunlight with someone he loved nearby. That was enough. That was everything. And to you, listener, thank you for walking this quiet path with us, for drifting through corridors of memory and light, for letting the story cradle you as you found your own rest. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.